Good evening, Facebook. So, today is day 3 of my mental health awareness challenge. And just as a way of reminder, I was nominated to go on the challenge by my good friend, Reverend Victoria Lawrence. And Victoria Lawrence herself was nominated to go on the challenge by our own friend, Antonia Justin. So I've committed to doing 25 days of giving a tip about an aspect of mental health over the next, today is day 3, so I've got 23 days to go. I did I didn't do a recording yesterday. However, today I'm on letter B. For those who are joining us for the first time, what I did say I'll do is to go through the alphabets of the alphabets and in the way they relate to mental health. So today I'm on letter B, and I'm going to be talking about bereavement and mental health. And this is bereavement is something that I can relate to on a very personal note. So I can empathize with anyone who is out there currently who has had a bereavement. And particularly, this period has been very difficult for a lot of people. It's very difficult for anyone to say that you don't know of a friend or maybe a family member or a work colleague or somebody that you know in your social circle from church or from your faith group that has actually been impacted by the deaths associated with COVID-19. So indeed, it's a very challenging time for most people, and it has been. However, in terms of thinking about bereavement and mental health, one of the things I wanted to say is that bereavement can actually lead to a number of mental health conditions. The most common will be for somebody to become depressed as a result of being bereaved, as a result of loss. And the other thing to remember is that bereavement is not just associated with the loss of a person, a loss of a family member, a friend, or a good colleague. Sometimes it's actually the loss of other things such as loss of status, loss of career, loss of jobs, loss of relationships, even loss of a marriage, for instance, divorce. Those are losses, and sometimes people can actually experience a grieving reaction from those losses. And sometimes it's difficult for those who don't understand to think, what's the big deal? But there is a big deal because a loss is a loss. And so there are there are other things that could occur from from bereavement, anxiety disorders as well. People could become very anxious. For instance, I do know of instances in which people lose stand as security figures of stability in their lives, and as a result, they suddenly develop panic attacks. They find it difficult to go out, or they find it difficult to socialize. So it's not unusual for people to have these experiences. So bereavement can be a trigger factor for mental health problems. Those who are more prone to suffering from mental health difficulties after a bereavement are those who have a coexisting or a previous mental health condition. Those who have had their losses in a peculiar way. For instance, for those who have experienced loss to somebody, a family member, a close friend, to suicide, they might be more prone to developing mental health problems as a result of that. Or people who have found themselves in a situation in which they've not been able to grieve for one reason or the other. They've not been able to express their grief the way they would want to. They might also be prone to abnormal grief. Also, at times when the relationship has been ambivalent, and that's very interesting. Sometimes you find that a person loses their spouse with whom they've been estranged, or maybe even they've been divorced, or somebody, a family member with whom they've not had a good relationship for a while, and then the person passes away. And other people would think, oh, they didn't have a close relationship anyway, or things were strained. But we do know that even those type of strained relationships could actually precipitate an abnormal grief reaction in which somebody then develops mental problems as a result of the as a result of the loss. So talking about people also talk about the common emotions that people go through after a loss. The thing I want to say this evening is that it's very important for anyone not to be judged by what the book says, that it takes only 6 months for people to grieve, or it takes about 1 year for people to grieve, or 2 years for people to grieve. I think that everyone grieves in their own way. That's what we now know. What we know from science is that everyone grieves in their own particular way, and no one should be judged for expressing their grief in the way they do. And the other thing is also that people could have a series of emotions and feelings. The common ones that people talk about is that in the very early part of the bereavement, there's a feeling of numbness in which somebody just feels very detached from the whole thing. It's like, on a personal note, the way I can describe it is that I just felt like I was in a bubble. It just felt like everything was unreal and I was on autopilot. That's a very good way to describe it. After a while, perhaps after a few days, perhaps after a week or so, it depends on individuals. Like I said, people then begin to feel in a state of denial. It's like you think that it didn't happen. That loss is not true. That person is going to come back. That mother is going to come back. That father is going to come back. That child is going to come back. And you just almost carry on like it's not true. However, we do also know that that feeling of denial would then give way to sometimes feelings of anger and guilt. Feelings of anger in the sense of the person just feels angry. You might feel angry towards the system that maybe the doctors and the nurses didn't do enough to save your relative. You might feel anger towards yourself, that you didn't do enough to save your relative. If you'd been there, if you'd been at the bedside, if you'd spoken to the doctors, maybe some things would have been different. You also have people who then begin to feel guilty about not doing enough. And these are all normal feelings associated with bereavement, with the grieving process. After a while, that could lead to sadness. Sadness is also the sadness of what could have been, what's never going to be. And then going on, that will usually then progress to a place in which after a while, somebody begins to accept that things are never going to be the same again. It's very important, however, to find out that from the period of acceptance, somebody can suddenly go back to the place of anger or guilt or sadness. So it doesn't mean that, so if you find a friend or somebody in your social circle who suddenly starts crying over a loss, maybe 6 months on or 1 year on, please bear with them. Don't be judgmental, please, because grieving is a very peculiar, it's a very difficult process, and there's no textbook way of doing it. So in terms of how to help yourself, what are the things that you can do to help yourself if you are facing grief at this time, if you are facing bereavement and you are grieving? Structure is a very important thing. To try as much as possible to keep the structure in your life. It's not advisable to do things like staying in bed, sleeping into the day. Those type of things are not advisable because they make you ruminate upon your loss. And when people ruminate upon the loss, it just festers and the emotions spiral down. So it's important to try and get some structure. It's also important to take care of yourself in terms of eating well, sleeping well. And that's one of the things that people who are in your support network can do for you at this time, to make sure that you are eating well, to make sure that you sleep regularly, to make sure that you are taking good care of yourself, exercise, fresh air. All of those things matter at a period of particularly acute bereavement. The other thing to do is to reach out for support. It's very important to reach out to your social network. There's always a risk or a tendency or a temptation to keep yourself to yourself, but it's not a time to do that. It's really a time to reach out. And then that brings me to the next point. How do you support people who are in your social circle who have suffered a bereavement and they are going through grief? One of the things you can offer them, one of the greatest gifts you can actually offer them, is the gift of listening. Just being there, non-judgmental listening, just being a friend. Just sometimes they will want to talk, sometimes they don't want to talk. Just being in their lives, physically being there for them. Thankfully, the the lockdown is easing up now, so physical contact can be made. Just being there might be one of the things you can do for them. Practical help like doing their shopping for them, like picking up their children from school, from the playground, or dropping them off. Just being there for them, asking them how they want to be supported. That's also a powerful thing that you can do. And then helping them to access help, helping them to listening to them as well, just listening to what they've got to offer or what they've got to say. You might find that somebody keeps repeating the same thing, just going over the story of the final days, or going over the story of the things that how the final hours were, or the precious moments that they spent with their loved ones. Just being there to listen might be a very powerful thing that you can give. And of course, for the person who is also grieving, one of the things that you can do is to control the atmosphere in your home, the atmosphere around you. Music is a very powerful thing. Like I said, I'm a Christian, and worship music is something that I know does change the climate in a place. It just lifts, it just creates an atmosphere of light. It creates an atmosphere, it lifts burdens. It creates a light atmosphere in terms of, in terms of not feeling heavy. So playing music, the type of music, particularly worship music, I find can actually change an atmosphere and lift things for you. So that's all I wanted to share this evening. And importantly, back to the point of getting help. If you do feel that you are now at a point in which you are developing a depressive illness, or you are getting anxious, the recurring panic attacks, the first person to speak to will be your GP. In addition to that, CRUSE, as in CRUSE, they are the leading organizations that provide, they are the leading national organization that provides bereavement counseling. And also we do now know that there are counseling groups, particularly Christian counseling groups. There are other counseling groups that would actually provide a faith-based counseling for those who need it. But the important thing is really not to suffer in silence and to reach out for help. And once again, I want to end on this note that there is light at the end of the tunnel. My heart empathizes with you at this time. I haven't been there myself, and I just want to say that there is light at the end of the tunnel. So please do get help. Thank you for listening.